Sorry for running late, but it is for a very good reason. So, welcome everyone on our evening session and I'm really happy to present Dr. Maren Wehrle, who accepted to be with us at this conference, and many of you already know her work that was important for us in the context of this conference. She is an associate professor in practical philosophy at Erasmus School of Philosophy with an extensive research trajectory in Husserl. She worked as a postdoctoral researcher and lecturer at the Faculty of Philosophy in Louvain, Belgium. Her areas of specializations are phenomenology, philosophical and historical anthropology, feminist philosophy, and cognitive psychology, all of the expertise relevant to our topic. She authored many articles and also books on the topics like embodiment, habit, normality, attention, and normativity. Among her books, we can maybe highlight the Introduction to the Method of Phenomenology, as well as the Horizons of Attention. Without further ado, thank you very much, Maren, for being with us and for sharing also time to be at the seminars and the sessions, as I know you are involved and people were thrilled to have you there. Please, we have 1 hour, so it will end after 6 as well, and all the sessions there will start accordingly later, okay? Welcome. Is it loud enough? Do you hear me clearly? No. You'll have to,
Okay, that's better. So thank you very much for this very kind and nice invitation and introduction, Agatha. I see many familiar faces here. Thank you. Some of you have listened to a similar talk here, so please, my excuses. I hope I will not bore you with this, but it's a slightly different version. And yeah, as you see, probably some of you, maybe my generation, or maybe a little bit older than me, might have recognized that the title is actually the line of a song by Tracy Chapman, Telling Stories. And this is kind of a methodological project I have, taking song titles or lines of songs as a sort of musical epopee to watch at my own research and thinking through a new perspectives. So to alienate myself a little bit, you can say, or to distance myself and really take this song text seriously and kind of test my research through them. And this is one project I have here with this song by Tracy Chapman. So I also start with that. So what will await you? Oh, sorry. Okay. That's the structure. So I will have an intro, the space between. I will have a first part on individual normality or becoming normal, and on intersubjective normality, which is the focus of this, my recent research, or what I would like to call here the making of normality. And I will conclude by returning to the song and the motive or the narrative. There's friction between us. Let's start. So as you say, there's friction in the space between us, the lines on your page of memories. Write it down, but it doesn't mean you're not just telling stories. There's friction in the space between you and me. What I take Tracy Chapman to be addressing in these lyrics is not something unique to romantic relationships, but a crucial problem of all human relationships, and moreover a genuine phenomenological topic, the tension between my experience and your experience of the world and the struggle over whose perspectives are closer to reality or the truth. There's an unbridgeable gap between my experiential life, which is immediately accessible to me, and that of the other, which I can only mediately observe, empathize with, or addressed through communication. I will never be able to feel exactly what the other is feeling or experience a situation identical to theirs. As I do not share their body, consciousness, habits, abilities, their memories, past experiences, their social and family situation or history. I have unique needs, vulnerabilities, interests, and convictions that shape my perception, my attention, my feelings and thoughts, and they have theirs. However, the space between you and me also denotes something positive, as Husserl emphasizes. It is precisely the transcendence of the other as other subject that is experienced here. In the withdrawal of the other and their experiences from my consciousness lies their essential character as a conscious, animated, and bodily subject. Unfortunately, in everyday life, it's not so easy to bear this withdrawal, and therefore one tends to fill these gaps with fiction. That is, one creates coherence and consistency by actively narrating or telling stories. We find this space between already within the course of our own life and experiential history. Sometimes we must make a real effort to link our past and present selves in a consistent way. What has the angry and lost teenager from a so-called uneducated and rural background in common with a philosophy professor in a diverse and urban environment, in my case? Often we forget the contingent events, the arbitrary actions and decisions, the detours and failures, and most importantly, the fundamental roles played by others in what we have come to be. Rather, we let our story appear as part of a linear and individual success story, a big plan or vocation that has culminated in the present. Even if we immediately write down what we have experienced, Tracy Chapman warns us, this does not mean that we are not just telling stories. This is because we are condemned to make sense of the world, as Merleau-Ponty emphasizes, despite or because of our ever-changing and ambiguous relations to the world. This often displays in an attempt to maintain familiarity at the expense of a richer, more complex or profound access to the world and others. This does not exclusively apply to those instances in which we explicitly narrate experiences to fit our self-image, worldview, or presuppositions. It happens already within everyday perception and bodily praxis, where there is a passive tendency towards concordance, or as Miranda Aldea would call it, a normalizing stance. Phenomenologically speaking, subjects make or maintain normality on different genetic levels by anticipating the familiar in perception, by performing routines in bodily habit or action, and by telling stories, beliefs, and narratives. On the more explicit level of language, this normalizing stance of everyday experience is expressed in the attempt to actively integrate or curate events into a coherent life story, or as Tracy Chapman puts it, the fabrication of a grand scheme. And this is especially so in social media and Instagram, as the younger generation. More importantly, when we are just telling stories, there's the risk that we do not account for the various perspectives of others. There is fiction in the space between you and reality, Chapman sings, as if she wants to point out, much in the way that Husserl and Arendt had, the importance of intersubjectivity and plurality in this storytelling. To claim reality or truth requires other perspectives and witnesses. Otherwise, what we experience is merely subjective, an opinion or a story among others. As we are embedded and situated in the social world, everything we experience already includes others, directly or indirectly. Although we might be the main figure in our story, we are not the only one. Our life is enabled and conditioned by others, and we in turn need them to listen, to believe, and retell our stories. However, we often avoid a real encounter with other subjects and approach them through familiar, that is, stereotypical lenses, negating their individuality and unique perspectives, or using them as extras in our stories. To be the hero of one story, someone else needs to be the the scary monster, as in the lyrics of Chapman, or the one to be saved. Here we see an ethical and political dimension inherent in Chopin's song. Who gets the chance to tell their stories? Who is most visible, heard, and believed? And what kind of fictions dominate the space between? I start, as I try to be as transparent as possible, with my starting points. So I think everyday experience has a passive tendency towards coherence. So, and as I said, we maintain familiarity on different levels. We're anticipating the familiar by doing the routine and by telling stories. And I think the problem, if you would, or what is interesting me here, is that a lack of plurality or intersubjectivity of various different perspectives of potential and actual others. I have assumptions, of course. So the objective is intersubjective experience. I focus here, and I think you have to look at it from an epistemological, political, and ethical dimension. And I also think that to really explain concrete intersubjective experiences, you have to look at the intertwinement of these levels. Mostly in other philosophical approaches, they are strictly distinguished. But I think the interesting thing in Husserlian and also Merleau-Pontin approach of normativity is that these levels are intertwined. So my approach is a phenomenological approach of lived normality, and I will go into that, so just in a short. In phenomenology, normality is a mode of experience, so it's never an adjective, something is normal or not normal, as someone is red, blue, or friendly or unfriendly. And this mode is characterized by two aspects, namely concordance and optimality, as he calls that. And a lot of people for whom this is really boring and already something established, because, as you know, my whole research is standing on the shoulders of Anthony Steinbock, so I'm explicitly honored to be, let's say, the first act for the main show. So thank you for this. So normal experience coheres with prior experiences or expectations, and B, objects in the optimality aspect are given with greatest richness and clarity. You can also say in a more practical way, environment is accessed in an oriented and suited or matching way. And why I do this, I think lived normality explains why intersubjective normality is needed for both, for normativity, but also for objectivity. So I start with my first part, individual normality or becoming normal. For some of you, this might be a repetition, but I think it's interesting none the way. Normality, as Anthony Steinbock already has beautifully put in his early work, but also in recent articles on normality, is one of the key concepts of Husserl's genetic phenomenology, where it functions not just as one experiential mode among many, but as a necessary condition of experience and objectiveness as such. Normality as a transcendental concept should thus define the conditions or genesis of a stable and meaningful experience of the world. When Husserl speaks about normality within his theory of perception and intersubjectivity, this is motivated by constitutional concerns. How does something take on sense or meaning? That is, how does something become normal for a bodily perceiving subject? In such an account, normality is A, not something that exists prior to experience or that can be established once and for all, but an ongoing process of becoming normal. And B, necessarily relational, as normality depends on the perceivers, their bodies and past experiences, their relation to their environment and other subjects. In Husserl's terms, normality is not merely a sense that is already constituted, and by which bodies are then evaluated or measured as normal or abnormal. Rather, experiencing subjects are themselves constitutive for normality. Normal experience must thereby consist of two aspects, as I said, concordance, Einstimmigkeit, and optimality. On an individual level, sensory experience is normal insofar as it is concordant with earlier sensory inputs, past experiences, and resulting expectations. This requires the different sensory inputs, touch, vision, audition, or smell, to be well integrated and the bodily movements and changes in perception to be aligned. On a practical level, habits and skills help to constitute normal experience. Here it becomes most clear that normal experience is integrative and relational. That is, it depends on the environment and how we inhabit it. Normal experience as concordant experience is thus most often habitual experience. Experiencing normally feels like a smooth and comfortable interaction with the environment in which the world, things, and one's body appear as self-evident or simply available. In this sense, there's a match between bodily subjects, their acquired habits, and the environment as a result of a successful inhabitation. However, this is not to say that normal experience is perfectly harmonious or consistent. Rather, temporary and partial discordances, Unstimmigkeiten, and irritations are normal within experience and even needed to continue to be able to experience normally. Discordances or deviations within experience indicate changes in our bodies, internal conditions, or the environment, external conditions, that require our attention. They give us information on how things appear in different contexts and how this in turn depends on our moving and changing body. Or they practically enable us to adjust our usual ways of perceiving or behavior to the changed circumstances. A well-known example from Husserl is how touching his beloved and familiar desk with a burnt finger feels different and irritating, that is, in discordance with his prior touch experiences of this object. And I always make this joke that this example shows what a kind of an armchair philosopher he was, of course. But we love him nonetheless. Other examples might include our usual ways of doing everyday things like standing up, taking a shower, or a daily run, that are no longer possible due to a temporary injury, illness, or pregnancy. This can be experienced either as discordance or rupture of coherent experience, or as inhibition regarding the practical possibilities of one's body, the bodily I can. However, discordances and inhibition can also be caused by external or environmental changes, such as extreme weather conditions, or moving to a different city or country, or finding that an everyday object that we rely upon has been damaged in some way. Such discordances, however, are not yet to be considered as abnormal in a normative sense. Rather, these deviations are modifications or alterations of prior or usual ways of experiencing a specific thing or situation, and therefore a temporary or local disruption within an overall normal experience. Husserl speaks in this sense of anomalies and not of abnormality, that break the internal coherence of experience and are often described as sudden, isolated, or intrusive events. After such an intrusive external event is over, the storm has passed, we have adjusted to the new city, or our things have been repaired, we can get back to normal. That means the former concordance has been reestablished. In this sense, the anomaly was an exception, a temporary deviation within and from an overall normal experience. However, when these events or bodily changes are long-term, a new concordance must be established in the form of a new sense or habit that is instituted over time. But does this mean that everything that is repeatedly experienced over a long time and thus becomes usual turns into a lived normality? Is being sick, being held captive, or in confinement, living under extreme weather conditions or oppression, ever to be experienced as normal? For Husserl, at least mere concordance, that is coherence, temporal continuity, and integration of different senses or contents, is not enough to call experience normal. To be a full-fledged lived normality, this concordance needs to be accompanied by optimality. This refers to the ideal bodily and external conditions of experience. An optimal experience is an experience A in which things appear maximally differentiated, rich, clear, accessible, well-oriented, or B in which a living being has the greatest range of possibilities, is able to move about and act without inhibitions or restrictions, feels more pleasure, less pain, is more creative, normative. You can also see here that I think the relation to Canguilhem, we had these talks before, and also to Goldstein in this sense. Naturally, which conditions, perspectives, or experiences are preferred will thereby depend to some extent on one's needs, interests, or plans. Even if you look at normality from a merely aesthetic or epistemological perspective, as in the normal givenness of a house, optimality has an inherent aim or motivation of this perception, or this as an inherent aim must be included. Experiencing a house normally requires that the various sensory inputs match, and prior perspectives are temporally and associatively linked to current and future perspectives, like the backside of the house, so that our anticipations and expectations are fulfilled. But the givenness of the object requires much more than this. It requires specific bodily conditions, the right distance, sensory capacities and bodily skills, and external conditions, lighting, positioning of other objects, etc., as well as the right relation of body and object or environment, if it is to be experienced optimally. My experience of a dog, for example, cannot be optimal if I only see or hear it from a distance. And my experience of you, especially with this light into my glasses, is also far from optimal, I must say. So, optimality is not something that exists prior to experience, nor can it be ever fully achieved. Rather, it is an intrinsic aim, motivation, or motor of perception and action, driven by an interest. For this reason, Husserl speaks of relative optima within perception that are dependent on individual or communal interests and aims. These can differ between time, place, and subject. For example, the optimal givenness of a house is different for a pedestrian than for an architect. Just whereas regarding concordance, normality tends to confirm expectation and thus merely has an operative character of fulfillment, taking optimality into account, normal experience also must adequately fulfill one's intentions or actions. However, with Husserl, we can emphasize that there must be, at least epistemologically, an objective optimum beyond mere subjective interests or intentions. And I think this point was criticized, especially in critical phenomenology, and I would also term myself a critical phenomenologist, but I think we should still argue for an objective optimum. I hope after my talk this will be clear, or hold on to it in some sense or another. For Husserl, this is the ideal of the most differentiated, rich or clear givenness of an object, or the world understood as an open horizon of possible experience. The optimum therefore serves as an inherent telos or norm, a norm that is never fixed but constantly changes due to changing aims and bodily or environmental conditions. For example, if one undergoes an optical surgery or gets a new prescription for glasses, their new sight is not normal because they now adhere to the statistical average or go back to a natural or original state. Rather, seeing after the surgery is the new normal because it optimizes one's ability, and I quote Husserl, to enrich the content of the world so that it has more determination than I knew before, end of quote. In this sense, the optimal givenness of a dog cannot be reduced to my perspectives on it, actions toward it, or beliefs about a dog. Instead, my type of a dog needs other perspectives to be representative of the diversity of existing dogs. Moreover, discordant experiences may be essential to making my experience of a dog optimal. For example, upon discovering a new species of dog, although the dog may behave discordantly or look unfamiliar, the experience itself is optimal as it enriches my understanding of the different ways dogs may behave and look, and so on. This was a citation of Tris Hedges in an recent article. So, in summary, while normality as concordance might be called proto-normative, as it leads one to expect something or someone to look or behave in a specific way, and thereby sediments pre-existing patterns of concordance or norms, normality as optimality is explicitly normative, as it differentiates already on the lowest level of perception between better and worse, preferable or not. This is why something that was formerly anomalous and or discordant within experience can become the new normal. Not only because it becomes concordant by repetition, but because it is indeed more optimal, that is, differentiates or enriches one's experiences of the world in an epistemological sense, facilitates specific actions in a practical sense, or allows for a better political representation and inclusion of different needs and interests, if you want to apply that to a political sphere. Because lived normality must always be both concordant and optimal for an individual, it can never be reduced to mere concordance, consistency, or familiarity, that is, to something that was normal in the past. Rather, normality is always in the status of becoming, and an anomaly or discordance can therefore function innovatively in the institution of a new normality, and thus new norms. This becomes especially obvious when we turn to the intersubjective dimension of normality. Individual experience must be in accordance with that of others to be called normal. Otherwise, it would be a mere illusion, hallucination, or narcissistic fantasy. The same holds true for the criteria of optimal experience. Although optimal experience is relative to individuals and their projects, there must be something like an intersubjective optimum or objective criterion that safeguards the possibility of objectivity, successful communication, and interaction. In one sense, lived normality is always already intersubjective, you might say, in that every subject is situated within a community and culture, starts experiencing and exploring the world with and under the guidance of others, and constitutes sense and meaning jointly. But normality is also intersubjective in a more direct or literal way. It is intersubjective not merely as the result of past intersubjective interactions, but as a present interaction in the form of an encounter, confrontation, exchange, dialogue, or action between subjects, as a face-to-face encounter, in which one's established lived normality is either confirmed or questioned. It is here that normality and norms first arise. In this more literal sense, intersubjective normality should not be understood as already instituted sense, but as an event where sense is instituted, transformed or reinstituted, where the making and unmaking of normality is happening. An analysis of intersubjective normality thus must remain within the first person or second person perspective. However, the established results of such an analysis, and that lays out the intersubjective institutions or constitutions, the sedimented sense, we then can call a social normality. Yeah? Viewed from a static phenological perspective, social normality cannot be defined as a lived normality, but rather as a represented normality, as I would call it, since it represents what counts as normal in a specific time, culture, or community. However, viewed from a genetic phenological perspective, social normality is not primary. It is the established and sometimes violent oppressive result of intersubjective normality. Here, lived intersubjective normality is primary, since it provides the conditions for the development or institution of social norms, their establishment, and the possibility of their transformation and change. Social norms and social normality are thus understood as instituted via intersubjective encounters in which individuals interact and develop habits and routines together. Then, afterwards, they sediment and materialize in traditions and institutions, like a university, for example. Here, the making of normality goes from largely implicit and fluid interactions and negotiations towards more explicit and fixed normative standards, or even laws and rules. Stable patterns of behavior, concordant patterns, that were established via repetition to facilitate one's cooperation and collective actions, just make them more optimal, transform then over time into more general expectations and normative imperatives. As Berger and Luckmann would put it, from a there we go again, we eventually arrive at a this is how things are done. However, once this social normality is firmly established, its original purpose is often forgotten, as are the historical or practical conditions of its human making. Tensions and discrepancies of various kinds always emerge, both between individual and social normality, between different social normalities, and generatively speaking, what one experiences as concordant or optimal is not merely based on past personal experiences, but also on the way that one is socially situated by accident of birth, culture, and social economic milieu. This in turn implicitly shapes one's style of perception and attention and operates as a standard for one's behavior, action, opinion, and values. And while some have successfully embodied such a social normality, which in turn enables and facilitates their social interactions, for others, the same social normality can be experienced as something external, limiting, and even oppressive. In this sense, there is friction in the space between you and me, you and reality, and you and everybody, as Chapman sings. From an epistemological perspective, intersubjective concordance and optimality guarantee and safeguard objectivity and truth. Other subjects or communities either confirm or correct my individual experience. That is to say, there must be a concordance not merely within my course of experience, but also within and between a plurality of the appearances of others. Objectivity in its very definition points to the fact that something is not merely subjective, but in principle accessible to all. My evidence thus needs to be completed and confirmed by others, by your evidence. And my experience must be in concordance with yours. I cannot just state that I see a unicorn flying over here if no one else is seeing this, luckily. Concrete intersubjective encounters depend thus on two conditions: a body and bodily abilities that are, I say, in principle, so common to all possible perceivers, and this is a minimal condition, and a spatial and temporal sphere common to all actual and possible subjects. Both aspects, concordance and optimality, thus result in a proper normality only if they are determined not only individually, but also intersubjectively. To illustrate this, Husserl uses the controversial example of a colorblind person. The experience of the colorblind person is not discordant merely because it deviates from a majority of color-seeing perceivers, but is, according to Husserl, less optimal and thus not normal in a more general sense. Objectively speaking, color perception is more optimal since it gives a thing or the world in a more enriched and differentiated way. Therefore, at least for Husserl, it is self-evident that colorblind subjects would recognize that their experience is not only deviant, but also less optimal compared to normally sighted subjects. This is, of course, only true regarding their visual perception and not their overall experience, and that is crucial. Husserl and his account of normality would never say this subject is abnormal. Yeah? It's always about a specific thing or a specific modality. Yeah? It's not an ontological concept. Colorblind subjects could, for example, have other enhanced sensitivities, perceptual or bodily abilities, and in this sense contribute to new normality standards. However, regarding this specific faculty, one could argue that the possibility of seeing colors allows an additional access to the world through which one can perceive something with greater differentiation or clarity, thus more optimal. From this argument, however, it also follows that we cannot define normal perception once and for all, since it develops and changes along with our individual or intersubjective possibilities of accessing the world. New technological developments may provide new possibilities for accessing the world and allow us to experience in more refined and distinguished ways, though they might, as we see today, also limit and diminish experience in other ways. From an epistemological perspective, normality entails thus a scale of optimum perception that is not relative to current individual subjects, but aims at the best possible access to the world for all possible subjects. In this regard, other perspectives and the resulting discordances or differing optima serve as a necessary corrective, complement, or enhancement of perception. However, and here's the but, from a situated sociocultural or political perspective, one must always study carefully which groups have the power to determine what counts as optimal perception or as suitable behavior. From this perspective, optimality is not an ideal concept. It is a concrete and relative concept that cannot be defined without the context of a particular environment, particular aims, practices, interests, or values. And although intersubjective experience and interaction does require a minimum of concordance to ensure objectivity, that is a common spatial and temporal ground that is valid and potentially accessible to all, these experiences and interactions are already situated and shaped by concrete material, cultural, political conditions that make one experience the same thing or event or world even differently. Frictions in our usual course of experience, events that interrupt the concordant flow of perception, are in this sense important and necessary. An irritation, surprise, or negation of something we expected to happen can help us to question or update our anticipations or ways of doing things. However, discordance and friction can also come with discomfort, exclusion, or anxiety caused by a lack of familiarity, stability, and orientation. And that brings me to this, the guide to avoid friction. To cope with this, we employ different strategies that allow us to continue anticipating the familiar, establishing a routine, or telling stories. We might, for example, avoid, ignore, or deny different perspectives or behaviors, or we might declare them to be exceptions, or else appropriate and colonize them into our own normal experience, behavior, or narrative. Here, the political dimension of the normalizing stance of experience comes to the fore, when one avoids, resists, or negates discordances in intersubjective experience and tries to maintain familiarity by excluding, downplaying, or negating different perspective, facts, or bodily subjects. One might, for example, attempt to avoid discordances and frictions altogether by staying within the safe space of a familiar environment, or home world, as Husserl called it, and surrounding oneself with only like-minded people. Such strategies are no less common in academic ivory towers than they are in rural village communities, urban subcultures, or gated communities. They are made even easier with the help of personalized information feeds that present everyone with their individual news, entertainment, and social media. A more implicit strategy for avoiding friction is by approaching people according to their supposed type. This can lead, in turn, to I cite Tris Hedges, discrimination by misperception, and discomfort on the side of those who are misperceived. Various anecdotal and factual examples can be cited here, from minor and even funny ones, as when the author of this, or the speaker of this talk, as a young white blonde woman, was approached as a waitress during the reception of a philosophy conference. And that's years ago, so now I'm too old for this kind of misperception, so luckily. Rather than as a participant. To more severe, exclusionary, and even deadly ones, as when female-read doctors are addressed as nurses, or a black female lawyer is presumed to be a defendant in court, or cases where people of color are immediately identified as criminals, rather than as victims seeking help, with often tragic consequences. In these cases, as Tris Hedges emphasizes, the discriminators, I cite, refuse to even acknowledge a disruption in their normative framework and impose a matrix of intelligibility on marginalized subjects. Quote, and. In more bodily or practical terms, one can speak of blinkers of habits or racist habits of seeing, as Helen Enjo. Another example would be the immediate bodily reaction of a white person clenching their bag or purse when a person of color enters the room, or known as the elevator effect by George Yancey. In all these cases, one can see how a social normality with a patriarchal or racist structure is embodied in the way we feel, perceive, and behave, as well as in our implicit normative frameworks. Seeing people of color as cleaning personnel rather than professors within university halls, or clenching one's purse when black people enter the room, or imagining people with a disability as pitiful victims rather than as extraordinary athletes, musicians, or scientists, is precisely anticipating the familiar, doing the routine, and telling stories in a patriarchal, racist, and ableist societies. I come to the closure. So, I think these social norms can absorb the space between. What do I mean with that? Here it becomes obvious that intersubjective encounters are already situated within an existing social normality that shapes one's style of anticipation, behavior, and beliefs about the world, and that assigns typical roles and places to different people. Such a social normality functions as a constant background, as Sarah Ahmed has illustrated in the case of a phenomenology of whiteness. It is not merely incorporated and expressed in habits, but also materializes in the environment and institutions. These home worlds, or habit worlds, as Ahmed calls them, in turn shape the bodies that inhabit them, and by this also what and whom we encounter at all. This is why established social norms absorb the space between, which can exclude or limit a responsive personal encounter between individuals. Although all subjects share a common ground, that is space, time, and embodiment, and should be able to access the world equally as an open horizon, in fact, the concrete world is already ordered by social norms. It is a place where things and people have a certain place or are in place. and where things and actions are more available for some than for others. In this sense, marginalized bodies or social groups, although members of the same home world, are unable to fully inhabit it, move and behave freely within it. This is because they were not included in the institution of this social normality in the first place. Therefore, they are unable to share the familiarity, routine, or stories. Instead, they experience a continuous friction, distance, or discomfort between their individual lived normality and the represented social normality. Moreover, they and their ways of doing things are represented within these homeworlds as exceptions, or as defining their limits, the limit of this homeworld, as outsider or other. Take the example of a black person entering a typical pub in Cornwall, only to have everyone turn around and stare at them. This is a form of prejudice that Hedges describes as discrimination by dissonance. From the side of the discriminator, this is experienced as discomfort, since they are not able to freely move around or do routine things in the pub like drink or smoke or carry on a conversation. From the side of the discriminator, this starts with experiencing a discordance or dissonance regarding the discriminatee and the prevailing social normality or norms and the resulting expectations. This in turn expresses itself via a bodily and affective response to this discordance, a psychic somatic collision as Nirmal Puvar describes it. Although this reaction is habitual and is non-deliberate, one can nonetheless define it as a pre-reflective form of discrimination. And this illustrates the problematic side of an experiential tendency toward coherence, or as an habitual interest in maintaining familiarity. This normalizing stance is problematic as it often leads to a resistance to disconcordance, which in turn further stabilizes and sediments a no longer suited social normality and discriminating social norms. Instead of taking a discordant experience as an opportunity to adjust and expand one's expectations, types, or scripts are actions and how the actions and agents of a typical pub visit, for example. One rather declares these instances as exceptions. Rather than facing this friction and engaging in an intersubjective encounter, this really talk to someone, or also doesn't have to be in harmonious, also a discussion. To unmake social normality and together institute a new intersubjective normality, one tries to keep one's old normality at all costs. This can turn into a deliberate form of discrimination, a racist narrative or story, relying on the fiction that declares certain bodies to be intruders that should not be here as abnormal in the sense of unnatural or even dangerous. If such a narrative has solidified, for example, with the help of social media and the algorithmic content loopholes, an open and responsive encounter with the world or others, and thus a real friction, becomes impossible. The tendency to close oneself and one's group off from the friction of the world and others, and entirely rely on specific stories at the expense of a confrontation with discordances, especially shows in the face of crisis. Paradoxically, the more contingent the situation is, the more facts are resisted, and the more one relies on those, people, media, or groups one thinks can be trusted. In this situation, social media facilitates the creation of closed communities and stabilizes them via an algorithmic logic that is adjusted to the interests of the users, their past user behavior, and thereby intensifies their emotional engagement with the given narrative. This in turn leads to a continuous confirmation of one's beliefs and feeds people with supposed evidence for their narrative in the form of experiential testimonials or expert opinions. This goes so far that people no longer refer to or believe in a common world. As Hannah Arendt emphasizes, a basic common ground as potential horizon for all experiencing subjects is not enough to ensure that we share a world. So a common world in her definition is not merely a common horizon of potential perspectives, but depends on the actual conditions of her appearance. This applies to races and other exclusionary narratives, where a specific group functions as a scapegoat for internal problems and is thus dehumanized and excluded from the home world as nation. Here the notion of a common world gets a political and ethical meaning. To appear, something must be publicly accessible and viewed as relevant. In other words, to experience discordances and real friction in intersubjective encounters that in turn could motivate one to question one's normality, one needs to be open to others and their worlds and recognize their perspectives as relevant. The public is thereby not to be reduced to an already established institutionalized political or public domain, within a community or government, but can also refer to the constitution of new publics through people that come together in speech and action. In a concrete sense, the plurality of perspectives is thus not a mere epistemological condition of objectivity. It must be actualized, which is something we have to take up and do. This was a citation of Sophie Lloyd-Ward. However, with Husserl, one could add that this in turn already implies an objective common ground that transcends our subjective perspectives, limits our fictions, and serves as horizon of potential intersubjective encounters and frictions. Which brings me to my conclusion. Yeah. Phenomenologically, the question of truth or evidence depends on the possible experience of perspectives of other subjects. This makes evidence a dynamic, fragile, and open-ended issue. The inaccessibility of the other's experience and the necessary asymmetry in intersubjective experience leads to the gap between you and me, you and reality, as well as you and everybody else. What makes understanding and the safeguarding of a shared objectivity even more difficult is the situated and historical dimension of every concrete subjective experience. Different backgrounds, socioeconomic milieus, or cultural life worlds lead to different styles of perception, expectation, needs, and vulnerabilities. Here a political aspect comes to the fore. Who has the power to speak and be heard, and who has the power to ignore or silence others? Chapman wants us to be suspicious of those who claim to have truth, those that demand pity and blame others, as they are the ones that are visible, can speak up and be heard, in contrast to those who do not speak or do not appear in public debates. The dominant voices use their power to convince us that their truth is the truth, thereby denying other perspectives and violating the space between. Such a denial, diminishing, or appropriation of other perspectives, often accompanied with a universalization of one's own perspective, also has an ethical dimension. By disrespecting the alterity of others, one denies them their subjecthood, right to existence, or claim to reality. We thus need a plurality of perspectives not only in an epistemological sense, but also in a concrete political sense. In turn, the epistemological necessity of intersubjectivity has a normative relevance in a more fundamental sense. Phenomenologically, normality is just both, I wanted to convince you, the place where I start every concrete intersubjective encounter, that is, that which appears concordant to me, based on my prior experience and situatedness, but it's also the ultimate goal or ideal of this very intersubjective encounter. However, the development of a normality that can be lived not only by a privileged and dominant few, but by everybody, cannot succeed without constant discordances, irritations, and frictions between me and you, me and everybody. Chapman ends her song in supposed resignation, stating, I cite, "Sometimes a lie is the best thing." Here she points to the possibility of empathy and respect against a story that claims the truth and occupies the space between. A lie, as paradoxical as it may seem, can be intentionally chosen to respect the otherness and difference of the other. It can be a sign of taking yourself back, taking the other into account, and thereby safeguarding the space between as a place of possible encounter. In the end, the space between designates not only distance and tension, but an opportunity for subjects to meet each other and be responsive to each other. That there is space between us also means that we stand on the same ground, where we can meet, come together, or do things together and exchange our perspectives, feelings, and stories. The space between is a source of normative friction and conflict, but also the place where new norms and more optimal normalities are instituted. Rather than focusing merely on resistance against an already established social normality, it could thus be relevant to enable intersubjective processes of normality making, that is, to provide public places and opportunities where people with plural perspectives, bodies, and diverse social and economic backgrounds meet at eye level. Here we could stop clinging to our old fictions and begin to perceive the world and others anew. I think that's the aim of phenomenology. Do things differently and tell better stories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maren. I can share this mic with you if you want to sit, or you can stay. Since we started late and we want to honor as well people who are having presentations after, the discussion will be short, but we have time for a couple of questions. I hope I can see you. Yeah, please. But, Anna. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. I would like to ask you about one point, because you said that normality, normalcy, etc., is not given in that way that is called in phenomenology pre-given. Yes, I beg to disagree with that point, because from the genetic phenomenology point of view, what is treated as normal, normalcy, normality, yes, all that cluster of notions is a part of the sedimented layers of both individual homeworld and shared life world our homeworlds are based upon. It is not thematized in everyday experience, yes, and it is exactly what was also mentioned in your lecture. So I am just referring to that point, that it is only an encounter with an alien world that makes us aware of that, yes, and from genetic phenomenology point of view, this is the beginning of the Rick-Frage process, and we, in that way, can just peel off these layers, these sedimented layers, and also becoming aware of the fact that normalcy, normality, etc., always serves as that horizon of indeterminacy of our experiences, of our experiential life. Yes? So that's one point I would like to ask you, what do you think about it? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I would agree on all points, so I don't see the discrepancy here. The discrepancy between that we need something other or on, I mean, what you have to do in Husserl is, he has this theory of perception which starts really with time consciousness, you know, or passive levels of perception where you have these discordances which are something like, yeah, I touched the desk with a burnt finger, and then you have his whole thing about home and alien world, and you have to make a real effort to bridge that, yeah, because these are different levels of constitution, so to say. But I still think, even on these lowest levels, there is not something as in Kant, for example, and I think there Merleau-Ponty agrees with Husserl, there's not a certain kind of norm that shapes perception beforehand, but these norms are developed within perception. That's why they are not pre-given. But in order to be aware of this, you need this kind of irritation, and on the higher social levels, you need this confrontation with different, I termed this now, different perspectives or the other or different cultures. To be honest, I have my problem, that's why I use the word, the terminology home and alien world only once and was hesitant, because I think this is a very static concept in Husserl. So it's not as dynamic as this concordance and optimality. So I'm not quite sure how far it takes us if we want to apply this to more social and political context, because then you ask, okay, when does the alien world begin? What is the home world? Is it a spatial thing? Is it a subculture? So it gets really tricky. But I know someone like some other scholars who speak about nested normalities. This might be an interesting approach. But of course, yes, But even if you encounter an alien world, you encounter the alien world via a concrete subject you have to be responsive to. Otherwise, you not really encounter this world. You just, for example, when the Germans go to Mallorca, they don't encounter an alien world or have any contact with Spanish people, yeah, at the Ballermann. So this is not, I think, what Husserl meant. Yeah.
There was another question over there.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's really motivating. First, a comment, maybe both elements are meant to pick your brain on this. There was a permanent concern that I had, and I think you just nailed right on the point by calling normality as concordant as proto-normative, in the sense that I kept thinking throughout all these days that we try somehow to understand the concept of normality by, understanding it in itself without considering yet normativity. But it seems as if when we consider the case of optimality, immediately comes. So there's no way of completely separating both. And I think, at least for me, it clicked this notion of, considering as proto-normative. That's already there. Also because you based your work on, you mentioned it briefly, Steinbock's consideration that anomalies are not yet abnormalities, and also they have the richness of widening or expanding experience. And that, for me, I would think immediately that has some normative charge. And so I appreciate that. And the particular question that I have is, I know you don't consider yourself a critical phenomenologist, and it makes sense with the presentation, but I was wondering if this very conception of normality on the one side and optimality as not fixed concept that can transform themselves help in some way to rethink the relation between the transcendental structures and the current position of the quasi-transcendental structures. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love the work of most of the critical phenomenologists. I do not agree on all instances on their critique on classical phenomenology, especially not on methodological terms. I pretty much agree with the argumentation that was recently put forward by Maxime Doyon in his recent book. To make it short, I think it makes sense to call these historical structures quasi-transcendental. And I think the transcendental and the genetic phenomenology is highly applicable and highly complementary with critical phenomenology. So I don't see a tension there. And as Johanna Oxala said, the tension might be occur with eidetics or essentialism. But I would also say no, because this bashing of essentialism in Husserl is, I think, superficial, because Husserl is really differentiated. So he has a gradual model of essences starting from typification. And this is really something which also a type can change, is flexible, up to material essences, and he discusses if they are changeable too. And the only thing that's really a priori in a strict sense are the categorical essences. And everything that's critical phenomenology is about, namely the situated experience of specific groups, is not about categorical essences. So I think we can agree that, but they still want to make general assumptions on general descriptions, because they want to say that these group of marginalized subjects, they have a certain kind of structure in comparison to privileged or another group. And this is already an eidetic approach, because it's not, so it's, so thank you, Agatha, you mentioned my introduction to the method of phenomenology, which will appear in 2 weeks in English as Methods of Phenomenology. And I think I try to make this point as no matter what phenomenology we do, we all try to describe without prejudice, identifying the general, to whatever extent, and ask back to the conditions. And I think this whole debate is for me a little bit unproductive, because I think these approaches are complementary. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. That is a great news about the book. I would suggest to close and move, unless there is some very short and down to the point question or comment. If not, I would like to thank you, Maren, for this wonderful lecture. And we are going for our last sessions, parallel session.
And I urge the moderators to be here before 8 o'clock, please. Thank you very much, Maren.